liberalism is over as what we experienced it in the 20th century. It's now something very different. They've already been kicked out. Zionism on the left is not happening anymore. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in again, to use a outdated term for listening to a podcast. I finished the latest essay, The Left, Leaderless, Idea-Free, and Boring. And I wanted to do the recorded version where I kind of stray a little bit, color outside the lines. So this, and I thank my buddy Isaac for pushing me to write about this. I went to the second Sapir debate at the 92nd Street Y last week. Does Zionism have a future on the American left? That was the debate. For those who are new to this podcast or haven't read the Substack, Sapir, which means sapphire, is a Jewish intellectual journal, I guess you would say. It's a periodical, old school. I read it in print. It's awesome. And it's a project of Bret Stephens, the famous journalist at the New York Times, the opinion columnist, the right wing, I guess what passes for right wing. And he's really more of a centrist, I would say, maybe center right. But in any event, it's his pet project. A buddy of mine works for it. And I sat with his girlfriend as my second time buddy to go to the debate. So the question, does Zionism have a future on the American left? I mean, the question answers itself. It's really kind of not the greatest question. It's meant to be provocative, I think, to bring in the audience members who are almost entirely on the left. We'll talk about that in a minute, see if I'm right in saying that or not. There's actually a way to quantify that. But, you know, if you don't think you know the answer right away to that question, either you're just talking about hope and maybe Pollyannish optimism, not grounded in reality, that thinks the American left is going to somehow become pro-Israel, or you can just sort of say, you know, let's just look at what the left is. The left is four different ingredients. You have the Democratic Party, legacy mass media, academia, and cultural institutions. And you could also throw in the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. It's sort of an adjunct to the Democratic Party, or it's sort of a branch. There's also the Working Families Party in New York, which doesn't represent workers or their families. And but in any event, there's the political party, the media, academia, and cultural institutions like museums and stuff like that. Do you think those four different groups are going to become more or less supportive of Israel's right to exist in the future? And by extension, do you think those groups, like the mass media, cultural institutions, do you think they're going to become more or less supportive of Jewish Americans, since most Jews like having Jewish sovereignty in a tiny sliver of the Middle East? So I just always like to remind people, you know, the left is very fixated on Israel. It gets a huge, disproportionate amount of media attention and academic attention and the kafiyas and so forth among young people as like a fashion statement. It's bizarre how much attention is put on Israel. There are 400 million sovereign Arab Muslims in the region. 400 million. How many sovereign Jews are there? 7 million, roughly. Okay, so it's kind of a big difference of numbers. But hey, you know, let's not talk about human rights in Egypt. Let's only talk about Gaza and the West Bank. Now, that doesn't excuse bad things from happening in any region of the world, but the disproportionate focus is really crazy. So if you're like, well, you know, Zachary, you've become red-pilled, you don't know what you're talking about anymore, you're just, you know, a Trumper or something, I would just say, now imagine the DNC convention in 2028. Do you think there are going to be more or fewer voices castigating Israel beyond any other country on earth? Like China, Venezuela, Syria, whatever, so on. Not that Israel is comparable to any of those countries, but what do you think the DNC convention is going to be like? 2024, Kamala Harris and the centrist power brokers were really effective of blocking out more extreme pro-Palestine voices from the convention. I don't think that's going to happen again in 2028. I think you're going to see more keffiyehs and Palestinian flags. Now, how do I know this? I don't know. Can't predict the future, but I can look at the No Kings rallies and the various pop-up kind of anti-ICE demonstrations happening in some blue cities across the country, and I can just look at how the left continues to accessorize. They've added Mexican flags. Okay, that makes sense for their immigration issue from their perspective, but you still see a lot of Palestine flags. I mean, it's become inherent in what it is to be left-wing, is to be pro-Palestine. And pro-Palestine does not mean pro-peace. It's not a peace movement. The pro-Palestine movement is exclusive. It's violence-based, from the river to the sea, so on and so forth. It's zero sum. And that's an accurate reflection of conditions on the ground. The Palestinian liberation movement, if you want to call it that, from the Palestinian perspective, is not interested in coexistence with Israel. We saw what Hamas did, and we're told all the time that they're not popular in the left-wing media press, but they're still in charge. So, and then Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar, Turkey, blah, 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 blah. This is not a peace movement. This is something that older American liberals, like maybe my mom and that cohort, they have a really hard time reconciling or even acknowledging, recognizing that the left wing of today is really different than the left wing of, let's say, the late 1960s, early 1970s, that kind of combined civil rights movement with anti-Vietnam War, which was very pro-peace. This is not what's happening now. So you can look at the No Kings rallies, you can look at the anti-ICE demonstrations to see the pro-Palestine iconography, which is, as baked in as the prior generation of a rainbow flag was for the left. You could also look at, okay, let's look at left-wing behavior towards Israel right now. Did the ceasefire change that? That's, okay, Trump, Netanyahu, essentially with lots and lots and lots of Gulf players, and I'm sure European powers in the background, created this unbelievable ceasefire. Israel got back all the living hostages. They're getting back many of the dead hostages. Hamas essentially ceded control of half of Gaza. They're consolidating their power, but there's a ceasefire. The war, that phase of the war is over. What's the left-wing response to it? Doesn't seem very supportive, or they even acknowledge it. You can look at the New York Times headlines, which are always painting Israel in the worst light possible, even during the ceasefire. There's no winning, I would say, for Israel and the left. So I think that answers the question of the debate. And then you could also look at how the left reacted to the Charlie Kirk assassination. I think many centrists on the left are horrified by assassinations, but the centrists aren't really in charge of the narrative anymore. Okay, so at the debate itself, there were four, very smart, very well-spoken, what I would call public intellectuals. They're kind of journalist types, political types, nonprofit types. And then the audience got to vote before and after, and then you could sort of see the difference. Okay, so let's just cut to the chase here. First of all, in the beginning of the debate and at the end of the debate, the majority of the room disagreed with the premise of the question. They think Zionism does have a future in the American left. It started, I think, at 57% felt that way in the room, and then it went down to 53%. So technically, according to a debate, the conservatives won the debate by moving more people into the no category, but nevertheless, they retained a majority, but a smaller majority. What I think is interesting about all of this is that 47% of the room started saying no. Now, this is in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It tends to be an older crowd who go to these types of things. Young families with young kids at home aren't going to go, by and large. And, I don't know, Gen Z types aren't really interested in this. The room wasn't, uniformly elderly, but it was certainly like an older cohort. But even in the Upper East Side, among older dyed-in-the-wool liberal American Jews, New Yorker Jews specifically, already 40-something percent, 43% started thinking, no, there is no future. And then that moved to 47%. So I think that's sort of an interesting thing to look at. As you can imagine, I'm really hopeful that American Jews stop voting blindly for the Democratic Party. I don't think the party is the Democratic Party that they helped create in the 20th century. I think it's changed a lot, and I don't think it deserves Jewish support. I don't think it deserves support from Black people or Latinos or gay people or a lot of different constituent groups, working class people, certainly not. A lot of constituent groups that I don't think the Democratic Party serves anymore. I think it serves a white liberal elite, mostly. And then maybe there's sort of like a radical non-white elite like Ta-Nehisi Coates and those kind of people. I think it serves them and their interests, but I don't think it's broader, much broader than that. So kind of neat to see how Jews are starting their feelings about this question just from the get-go. And you know, my big takeaway, it was kind of spoiler of the whole essay, is it's just so uninteresting to hear left-wing people talk about current affairs. It's all just kind of wish and hope and projecting their values. And, a lot of these are really good values of dignity and diversity and human rights. These are all very nice things. They just kind of project their values, but they're not really grappling with what's actually happening. And so it's kind of, it's nice to hear a hopeful statements. I guess I could subscribe to the Hallmark Channel on the holidays if I want, kind of a cozy Christmas movie, but this is not reality. And that's kind of shocking to me that more people don't seem to, well, maybe they are recognizing it. I don't know. But like why Bret Stephens is even interested himself in talking to people on the left, I think is interesting because I don't think they have much to say. Now, obviously, he filled all the seats in the audience. So kudos to him. He knows the room. He knows the environment of New York. He's survived at the New York Times as a center-right journalist that's pro-Israel and Jewish and openly Jewish. So that's super rare. So he did his job as a showman, but I don't think it's that intellectual to listen to left-wing commentators anymore. So the bigger kind of backdrop for all of this is the era of Jews, of American Jews as liberals, coming to a close. Now, Jews did not entirely create 20th century Democratic Party liberalism on their own, but they sure as heck had a gigantic, disproportionate role, not only in politics, in legislation, civil rights movement, and just a cultural discourse. Characters like Seinfeld, Larry David, Woody Allen, Philip Roth, so many writers, so many television personalities, so much of our culture and cultural institutions, all this talk about multiculturalism and diversity, a lot of that came from Jewish leadership. Now, there were already American liberals, of course, and the progressive movement in the Midwest and lots of labor movement things, although that was also heavily Jewish. I mean, there are a lot of different strains. Jews don't get all the credit for creating liberalism in this country, but they were one of the leading groups for creating this idea that to be American doesn't just mean being a WASP. It can be something bigger. And what the most profound essence of truth about that statement is that it can just be regular American. That's a flexible term, depends on your region, depends on your background, but Jews just kind of became regular Americans to a certain degree in the 20th century, and they used liberalism and the civil rights movement to get there. And it worked. It worked really well until recently. And so I think that this era is just over. I think liberalism is over as what we experienced it in the 20th century. It's now something very different. And I don't think Jews should be a part of it at all. And I think it doesn't really matter what I think. They've already been kicked out. Zionism on the left is not happening anymore. I mean, anybody who says that there's a future of Zionism on the left, which I know half the debaters were charged with saying, I just think that's so hopelessly naive that whatever they have to say is not really worth listening to, because it's just not. It's like me giving you a lecture about string theory. It's just not going to be very illuminating because I don't know anything about it. So how do you date this? Okay, so I'm saying Jews aren't even liberals anymore, and liberalism itself is over, bigger than the debate topic, but that's the backdrop. How do you date this? And I would say it would be about the ending. There's lots of ways of going into this, but I would say it's about the ending of the civil rights movement as the goals of the civil rights movement. I mean, I think that the pathology, the thinking of the civil rights movement is alive and well in the left. I think that's their whole thing, is diversity, DEI, all these things. Diversity is kind of their multiculturalism, is their most sacred value. But the actual goals of the civil rights movement, I'm old enough to remember, learning about this from people who were there, it had two goals, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. articulated them well. obviously, he articulated them the best, which was one is racial equality, and the second one is workers' rights. And he grounded all of this in the Hebrew Bible. It was just in the Parsha, it was just in the chapter that we read yesterday of Noah, Noach, as we say in Hebrew. All people are created in God's image, B'Tselem Elohim. And if you're created in God's image, then not one person is better than another person. We're all really up there with God, and God is singularly great. And we get a little sort of comparison to that singular greatness. And if we all get that singular greatness as individuals, then we're all equal. And Martin Luther King would say, that translates into America, the 1950s, 1960s, is you got to have equal social treatment, like no more racism, and you got to have some type of equality of financial opportunity, which is labor rights. So that's really great. And that framing set up American liberalism maybe for about 20 years. Maybe 50 years, 20 to 50 years, something like that. It certainly started to chip away in the 1980s and 1990s. When I was 1990s, I was in college. It started chipping away. There was what now we would call more woke, diversity classes in the university that were not intellectual. They were propagandistic. The Intro to Feminism, I'll never forget dropping out. I was auditing. I wasn't taking it for credit, but I just stopped going because it was so uninteresting. It was just basically propaganda about feminism, which I agreed with. It just wasn't intellectual anymore. It was just kind of ideological. I don't think that's great for university, but that's when I think it started. Nowadays, if I went back to UC Santa Cruz to get an undergraduate education, taking a look at the course catalog, I think it would be very hard to get the kind of education I did in the 90s now in the 2020s. And so there was a rise of, a lot of it was European, Michel Foucault, thinkers like that, avant-garde political science they were just writing it around then. And there was Edward Said as the Palestinian Egyptian literature professor at Columbia, who wrote a very influential book that really reframed the Middle East from a policy perspective for millions. And we also saw Islamic immigration to Europe and later to America. They were not really a predominant group in American politics. Now they more are, right? Mamdani is running for mayor. He is a Shia. I actually don't know enough about his religious upbringing, but I believe he's Shia Muslim. He's certainly Muslim. And there are, according to the New York Times, which is breathlessly reporting about all of this stuff, because the left and Islam have overlapped even though they're so antithetical to each other, they've overlapped so much in a left-wing perspective. There's more Muslim voters in New York than there used to be. So that, they're making their voice heard, and they have this very disproportionate representation in academia, which champions diversity, selective champion of diversity. So anyways, that's now changed, right? From the 1960s Democratic Party to the 2020s Democratic Party, there's all these different influences that just didn't exist in the early 20th century. And so now the left frames the world. It's a global struggle. It's this giant epic battle between totally blameless gender, sex identity, immigrant, racial, disabled, Muslim victims. There's the victim group. They call it the Global South, and they add a whole bunch of other people. And then on the other side, there's the totally guilty white, straight, cis male, able-bodied, Judeo-Christian citizen oppressors. And this goes under the rubric of settler colonialism, where you're either a settler or you're indigenous. There's no in between. The settler is always bad, and the indigenous person is always right. Now, in my last podcast, I talked about Hamas being an indigenous movement. So it's obviously pretty complicated. I guess Nazism would be an indigenous movement to Germany. Those don't seem to work very well in this framework, but nevertheless, this is the framework. It's which is really, really popular. I know I'm reducing it, and I'm sure some very smart academic like Zoran Mamdani's dad, I'm sure he's a smart guy, and we just disagree about everything. I'm sure they could say, no, you're oversimplifying it, but this is the dynamic that's taking over in the streets and in the Democratic Party. It's black versus white, good versus evil. It's the Star Wars Rebel Alliance versus Darth Vader's Empire, victim versus oppressor, liberation movement versus hegemonic power. So it's this just kind of like, a movie with the good guys and the bad guys, and they're always the same. The good guys are always the same. The bad guys are always the same. There's nothing they can do about it. And also, what's even more scary certainly after watching the Charlie Kirk assassination and all the attacks on Jewish people in this country, there's no more terrorism. There's no assassination. There's no hate speech. There's no violence. There's not even any street crime or discrimination coming from the left. That's not how the left calls their violence. They don't own it. Certainly, you haven't seen any reckoning after. We had no kings after Charlie Kirk's assassination. I didn't see like a massive church, synagogue, attendance spike by liberals lamenting the use of violence. No. They're doubling down. This is because terrorism, racism, discrimination, violence on the left is not terrorism. It's not violence. Those are just the only tools of empowerment and liberation available to minorities. They're forced to use violence because they're minorities and they're inherently noble as indigenous people. And it's the settlers, the white people, the Christians, and the Jews, apparently, who are to blame for their condition. So you can't blame a minority for fighting back the only way they can, with a knife or a gun. This is absolutely insane. It doesn't adhere to any of the morality of the Ten Commandments or any Judeo-Christian sense of morality. Certainly, it doesn't conform to Christian morality, but this is the argument coming from the left. And this helps you understand the connection between the pro-Palestine stuff. If people say about Mamdani, well, why does he care about Israel, Palestine? I'm voting for somebody to pick up the trash. I'm voting for somebody to be in charge of the NYPD. I don't care about Israel. And that person is smart to say that. But there is a correlation here between no cash bail for violent offenders, ACAB, which is all cops are bastards. I see that graffiti all over in my neighborhood. People call it decarceration, closing down prisons. Defund the police. They don't say that anymore. It's not politically palatable, but it is the idea behind their thinking. They just don't use those terms. Like Mamdani doesn't say defund the police anymore. He talks about violence interrupters. So those are non-police people that somehow are going to interrupt violence by being an interrupter. We'll see how well that goes. That has not worked in any other place it's been tried. And then this also explains by some more, radical musicians, celebrities, Zohran Mamdani's entire political movement of the DSA actually celebrate Hamas and Hezbollah as resistance fighters. They're in the minority, but you see them at all the rallies. There is the Irish rap group, which is so into Hezbollah and Hamas. Zohran Mamdani himself can't really criticize them. That's pretty troubling for somebody in charge of the New York police, who might be in charge of the New York Police Department. You would think they would be very anti-terrorism, but this is the overlap. If you're saying no cash bail for violent offenders, you're also saying that, well, I believe that because these poor Black people of their imagination it's not their fault that they're causing so much violence, right? The Black people in New York City disproportionately cause the violence, disproportionately in Black communities. And no, it's not their fault. It's because of settler colonialism. Same thing for Palestinians. So, this is also why I continue to see young white people wearing keffiyehs in my neighborhood, also while wearing a mask. It's really fascinating overlap. And these are they KN95 masks? I don't even know. Sometimes they're just cloth masks. I don't look super carefully, but that the correlation there is, it's more than just the settler colonialism. It's also this kind of real anxiety about health issues. It's a pathology. And they wear the keffiyehs. Let's just talk about the keffiyehs for a moment. They wear the keffiyehs because it's like they're superheroes. It's like a cape. I mean, if you look at a keffiyeh, you can imagine up and away into social justice land. They're virtue signaling. They're sending a signal to everybody else where they sit on the settler colonialism binary. It's the only binary they seem to embrace. So This also explains why the left isn't celebrating the current ceasefire in Israel and Gaza. I said before, it's because the left is not interested in peace. They're interested in violence and domination. And they're being true to their word. If the ceasefire was their goal, they said it was in earlier iterations of the war when Israel fought back initially. There was ceasefire talk, and then it kind of dwindled away into other phrases, globalize the intifada from the river to the sea, which is a lot more clear. But they're not celebrating the ceasefire because that's not what they want. They don't want a ceasefire. They want domination. They want a racially pure Arab Islamists controlling the entire region. It's called the Levant, that part of the Middle East where Israel and Egypt and Syria is. A black man murders a white woman in North Carolina on the train. That's just a call for help. That's not violence. I mean, it looks like violence. She's dead, but really it's just a call for help. And he's just like, he doesn't have any other options. And then, to assassinating a politically unfavorable speaker at a college campus because he supposedly is trafficking hate speech, that's just a fair response. That's just, he got what he deserved, right? Throwing Molotov cocktails at Governor Josh Shapiro's house, lighting elderly Jews on fire in Boulder, Colorado, attempting to kill Donald Trump twice. They had it coming. That's just like, that makes sense from the settler colonial perspective. That's really logical. So that's pretty scary if you're from the 1960s era of democratic thinking, but that's what's happening now. The internet amplifies it. It's just what's happening. So at the event, this wonderful journalist, Batya Ungar-Sargon, I think is how you pronounce her last name. What did you say, Batya? She just sort of encapsulated the whole dynamic very, very quickly. She just essentially, I'll break it down for you, which I've been saying now for a while, the left of the 2020s is not the left of the 1960s. Power dynamics, the settler colonial power dynamics, have supplanted Dr. Martin Luther King's Judeo-Christian value system. That's just what's happened. He's no longer, I mean, they might have pictures of him and they think he's great, like an earlier saint or something, but his viewpoint, judging a person by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, they believe in the opposite. You only look at the color of the skin. And if they act like a violent person, the content of their character, well, that's fine because they're black or they're brown or they're trans or they're whatever, Muslim. And, that's their only tools available. And so they've supplanted that thinking, and in their conception, Jews are powerful. American Jews are considered financially successful. Some are, some aren't. If you live in New York with a very large Jewish presence, you'll see lots of poverty among Jewish people. But the popular conception is that we're disproportionately successful, like how people would say Koreans are disproportionately successful. I don't know if that's true, but that's the perception. And obviously we're militarily powerful in the Middle East because we haven't all died. That's why Israel is powerful, because those are your options. You either have power and you live, or you don't have power and you're dead. So Jews are powerful, ergo we are bad, according to the new Marvel Cinematic Universe way of left-wing politics. What was interesting to me is this woman, Batya, articulated it so well, but nobody on the left, Yehuda Kurtzer, Kathy Manning, who is an older Jewish former North Carolina congresswoman, these are super smart people. They couldn't refute that framework. They couldn't really go into the deeper political philosophy that Batya recognizes and say, well, the left has changed, and of course Zionism is a casualty of that. That just seems so obvious and worthy of talking about other things, because that's just so obvious, but they just couldn't even recognize it. It just wasn't even something that they can talk about. So therefore, it's just kind of so interesting to hear them. It's just so uninteresting to hear them. It's just, there's no ideas there at all. Okay, so I talk a little bit about Bret Stephens. There's also a guy named Jamie Kirchick, who's I guess a very popular, more center-right, right-wing Jewish journalist. It just was kind of flat to me. Now, I went to synagogue the day after because I went on a Thursday, and then Friday night I was at synagogue, and there's a friend of mine there. He's an older guy. He's super, super smart. He's a journalist of many, many, many decades. I am sure he can spin circles around me about his knowledge of current events. He thought the debate was great and that Yehuda Kurtzer made lots of good points. So there you go. Different perspectives. I think my friend is very, very smart. I have a lot to learn from him, but I think that his conception and framing of politics is, maybe 20, 30 years out of date. He would say, what are you talking about? I work in the press. I know exactly what's happening right now. So I don't know. There's different perspectives of it, but I'll just kind of follow voting patterns and where my physical safety is to guide me. So now I was sitting next to somebody who's quite a bit younger than I am. She's a friend and she's very smart. We've been on a very similar journey. So I'm going to talk about her a lot, but I'm really just kind of projecting my own values and my own experiences onto her. But I find her as a useful avatar to kind of get out of my own self. So she, I would say that she started on the cultural left and now she is just much less partisan. She's more neutral in her political centrism. And I suspect that she really doesn't like surety, meaning she doesn't really like the confidence and braggadocio on either end of the political spectrum. I've never heard her say a right wing thing in my life. I don't think that's where she's landing, but I don't think she's with the left at all either. So it's kind of an interesting perspective to think about, to sit next to somebody who's, roughly, 20 years younger than I am. I think she's a little bit more than that. So she has a very different perspective. She graduated college at a different time. We come from the same milieu. We met in Jewish circles. So we obviously, as adults, identify as Judaism. And she's just been kicked out of the Democratic Party. No, yeah, okay. Oh, there's some centrists. Okay, there's like 5 elderly centrists in the party, but she is not. And there's a couple of exceptions, right? There's a Marine in Maine, there's a mechanic in Washington State, or Oregon, but these people are not leading the party. And why is she kicked out? Why is my young friend feeling as alienated as I'm feeling? And because I'm here, remember when the Democratic Party was great, like an old man lamenting his youth, the passing of youth. But no, this is something more present even in her life. And the simple explanation to a lot of my friends is that if you are Jewish and you started on the left, which 90% of American Jews start on the left, and you go and you were raised secular, and then as an adult, you get really into your Judaism. How did that happen? It happened because you went to Israel at one point in your life. That's really the narrative. That's the whole birthright program. There's lots and lots of reasons for this. But basically, in our parents' generation, they grew up however they grew up. My grandparents were immigrants. It's definitely like a more old world, Yiddish world mentality. But however they grew up, Israel wasn't really a thing that they could go visit. Technically, my mom was born 3 years before Israel was created as a nation state. There were Jews there, obviously, for a long time prior. But in her generation, it just wasn't common in the 1960s to go to Israel as a place to visit. Now, in the 2020s and the 2010s, it's just much more popular. And I'm sure there's lots of reasons for that, but it is just a thing that American Jews, a subset of American Jews, go to Israel. And they go with an open mind. They're curious. They're predisposed to be excited about it because it's the end of our 2,000 years of diaspora. So it's a positive thing to go. And it changes them. It just changes their identities. Not 100%, obviously, but by and large, if you start secular, left-wing Jewish, and you go to Israel, you will most likely supercharge your Jewish identity because it is like the living laboratory of Judaism is Israel. It used to be in Eastern Europe. If you're an Ashkenazi Jew, that obviously went away with the Holocaust. It used to be in North Africa and Baghdad and other Jewish historic centers in the Middle East. That went away in the 1950s when all the Muslims kicked them out. It used to be in Bukhara, in Uzbekistan, right? Jews lived there for thousands of years. That all went away with the end of the Cold War, and Muslim leaders took over Central Asian countries as they left the Soviet Union. So all those Jews had to leave, right? Because Muslims, even though they're championed by the left, don't have a track record of DEI, let's just say. They have a very different track record. So You go to Israel, that's the only place to really be Jewish, like entirely Jewish in the world right now. That's the location. It's amazing. You learn a lot. You learn the language, or you certainly encounter Hebrew and struggle with it, the rituals, the history, the current affairs, the ancient affairs, the text, the Torah, the Talmud, all of the text, the prayer books. You're just soaking it. And if you are curious about your identity as a Jew living as a minority in America, you come back to America after spending a week, a month, a year in Israel. You're different now. You have a point of reference that you never had before, and you can go back, go and return. And guess what? If you learn Hebrew, you can now read the prayer book. I couldn't read it as a kid. Now I can read it more or less as an adult. Some of it is hard, still hard for me. I'll always struggle. But the point is that Israel changes you as a person, as a Jew. Not everybody, but 90% get a real boost if they come from this particular secular background. If they were raised Orthodox, it's kind of already built in. But now we're told, no, you can't do that. That's bad. So you come back to America, you're still an American liberal secular Jew. That was still your background, but now you're really into Israel. And this happened to my friend. This happened to me and millions of others. And now you're told, no, actually, that's bad. You're a settler colonial. You're a racist. You want to kill children, all this crazy stuff that obviously is not only untrue, but how do I have anything to do with Israeli military tactics? I have not quite figured that out yet. And you're just kicked out of the party. So, and it's your fault because you're supporting genocide, you're supporting famine, none of which is documented. And it seems very poorly executed genocide. Shame on the Israelis. They're really bad at doing genocide. Gotta work on that, guys. But you're basically kicked out. And by being kicked out, it changes your perspective. Instead of having a sports fan, like emotionally charged mentality, my side is always right, your side is always wrong, which is what you read in the mass media. There's no curiosity even about Republicans or Trump or MAGA. They're just bad. You get much more dispassionate and much more skeptical of all the narratives, but especially from the legacy media. And I talked in an earlier Substack and podcast. This is why I think there's a correlation between legacy media and legacy politics, and why I think the Democratic Party, as it's shaped now, as it's going now, is just going to continue to lose. So I go into it a little bit more depth in the essay, but the legacy media, except maybe for CBS, now helmed by Barry Weiss as the editor-in-chief, minorities are always victims. Minorities are always right. Trump is always a fascist. I mean, that's the party line. Jews are lumped into the fascist part of this really dumb, inaccurate analysis, and we're out. We've been kicked out. Maybe that's why 43% of the room at the Y a couple of days ago already feel that there's no future. And these are like the Jews who go to the Y. These are the liberal audiences, and this is their conclusion. If journalism what does journalism means? I think it's about articulating current events in a clear and coherent manner so American citizens can make informed decisions. It's about what they want to buy, who they want to vote for, where they want to live. You need journalism to describe reality so you can make a decision, an important decision or a small decision, what movie you want to see or what school you want to go to for your children. But what the media is doing now, the legacy media, that's not reporting anymore. It's something else. You can, from the left or the right, you can call it propaganda, editorializing in the newsroom, selective bias. You can call it social justice activism to liberate minority victims from their straight white male oppressors. But whatever term you use, news isn't it. You just can't follow it. So why am I talking about this? It's because we come from a culture of reading the news as American liberal secular Jews. We love the news by and large. It's a big part of our identity is reading the New York Times. But the news of today is not the news what it used to be. It's activism. So back to the room. Kathy Manning, very smart former Congresswoman, Yehuda Kurtzer. I don't really know as much as I probably should about the Shalom Hartman Institute, but he's the head of it. They were really trying to convince us that the left isn't anti-Zionist, or if they are, they're going to grow out of it, which is just kind of silly if you look at the young Democratic Party. the young people are the ones that are the most ferociously anti-Israel. Mamdani is 34 years old. AOC, I think, is still in her like late 30s. These are young people. They're in charge now of the party. And if they're not fully in charge of the party, Hakeem Jeffries just endorsed Mamdani, so I think there you go, he is. But if they're not fully in charge in October 2025, they will be, October 2026. So why was I there, right? Why am I going to this, right? I obviously had a preconception, right? But I was also in the room to hear different sides just to see, hey, maybe I don't think I could be convinced wholly otherwise, but maybe there would be some good points for me to think about to complicate my narrative that the left is just kind of a racist joke at this point. For me, the joke is Queers for Palestine. That's either the most hilarious thing you've ever heard or just the most scary and just confusing and confounding. Obviously, it's all of the above. I mean, it is just bonkers that the young white people I see with a mask on wearing a keffiyeh in the subway, I'm sure, are in favor of trans ideology and believe in that stuff. And that's probably really essential to the way they look at the world. Of course, pro-queer, they are queer. That's a huge factor in their lives. So, and they're the ones wearing the keffiyehs. So I just think it just makes the liberal movement, the left-wing movement, just kind of like a theatrical joke. I don't know what it is. It's just like performance art. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's politics. But I wanted to see if I could hear something in the room that would complicate my narrative that I'm telling myself. And, I grew up on the left. I still read the New York Times on occasion. I want to, I'm optimistic that the country can become a better place. But what I got was left-wing spin and gaslighting from the far left. I mean, they just had nothing to say. They weren't the far left. That's incorrect of me. From the left-wing presenters, there was no analysis about what's happening in this country. What I did hear about our culture, demographics, the differences between party and non-state institutions, foreign policy, all of that came from Jamie Kirchick and Batya Ungar-Sargon. They had a lot to say. They were very interesting. I don't think they're on the far right. They're critical of many elements on the right. Obviously, as Jews, we're critical of any type of extremism because anytime there's extremism, we always get killed. So that's kind of easy. But they just had a lot of precise thinking. They were really keenly observing the culture. And obviously, they have a point of view about it, but they really seem to get it, what's happening right now in America. The left-wing people just didn't really seem to describe anything that I could recognize. Oh, the kids at the colleges are just going to grow out of their anti-Zionism. I mean, I don't know. It was just kind of, not where you go for ideas. And we're in a room that we're told is about ideas. So just for a moment, just forget about all the politics. Imagine you're a bored teenager, right? The bored teenager is the purest arbiter of all things related to themselves. That's how it works. It's great. It's a great moment of life. And I'm glad I outgrew it, but it's just one of the great things. Here we are now, entertain us, is what Kurt Cobain sang to me when I was in that phase of life. And it was totally accurate. Smells like Team Spirit. If you're looking for something, anything to keep you interested that speaks to your experience of the world, your sense of curiosity and wonder, listening to liberals explain that what you're experiencing isn't happening, or if it is, it's just kind of temporary and you shouldn't pay attention to it, is bonkers. I mean, you'll listen for a little bit longer just to see if they're kidding or not, and then you're going to change the channel. Because what's happening in the world right now with the change of the far left, with the MAGA revolution, that's all happening. And saying it's not is worse than wrong. It's just boring. They just aren't bringing any ideas to the table. They, meaning the left, the center left, the far left, none of them really bring ideas. Okay, the far left does bring ideas to the table. They're the ones with the settler colonialism ideas. But you know what I think of that? It just seems ridiculous. And what do they bring? What are they actually bringing to the table now in 2025, towards the end of the year? They're bringing no kings, anti-ICE. All right, what are they in favor of? I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to the Thatcher Report Substack too.